So glad you made it out today. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here. And if you've been with us over the last few weeks, you know we've actually been in a sermon series called For the City. And one of the things that we've been talking about is what marks us as people who claim to follow Jesus is that we are a people who live for something bigger than ourselves. So when the rest of the world might be telling us, like, live for your own selfish ambitions and your own kind of self-pursuits, instead, what does it mean for us to fundamentally live for something bigger than ourselves, including living generously and sowing deeply into the lives of others? Now, if you're not a Christian here, so glad you made it out today because you get to get this kind of distinct look at what Christians believe about how we're to approach life itself. Now, this For the City campaign is basically an invitation. The vision of it is we have acquired a property on 31st and Park, where this space is a space where we're looking to use it for launching new churches, which has been part of our short 7-year history as a church, as well as new kingdom ventures and all of the different ways that we want to serve generously and so deeply into what's happening in the city. We have purchased 4 of a 7-floor building of commercial space that we can use towards that end. We've got all sorts of vision for it, which we're very excited about. We were able to purchase it at half the market rate, and what we've been inviting our community to do is to give towards this For the City campaign. It culminates in a pledge day on December 8th, which is a Sunday, where we're inviting people to prayerfully consider pledging over the next 26 months. So that's 2 years, 4 tax years, to give towards this campaign to raise $2 million for us to be able to utilize this space where everything that we do except Sundays will be held in this space. And so that's the For the City campaign. You know, I thought that a significant part of this journey for us together would be to hear from voices of people who have been wrestling with this idea of generosity for a long time. One of my friends named Clement, who's been with us really from the beginning of our church here at Hope Midtown, he's someone who, of many of the people that I know, really thoughtfully engages this topic of money and faith in such a way that I truly respect and admire. And so I'm going to invite Clement to come on up here. He's going to share a little. Can we give it up for Clement, by the way? A little of his own personal reflections about money, faith, and all that good stuff. So here you go.
All right, so back in 2016, there was an oil pipeline project that was being started or talked about being started in the Midwest. And some of you might have heard about it. It's called the North Dakota Access Pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline, and also short for DAPL. And around that time, it really consumed the news, and so that's when I first heard about it. And at the same time, I learned about this term called divestment. And so in the same way that investing or investment is just a way to put money into something, divesting is the opposite. It's pulling money out of something or a cause or a project, and it's up to you to decide on what that's for, whether you just want to do it or it's for an intended purpose. You want to enact some sort of change. And so I was looking into how can we respond to this event of DAPL and possibly stopping it, because it's controversial in that it was infringing upon, say, the rights, land, and water of the North American tribe that was there. And so my wife and I talked about it, and then we ultimately decided that we were going to pull money out of one of the banks that we had our accounts in. And it was this bank in particular because this bank was one of the 17 identified banks that were funding this project. And so that story is an example to show just how it's possible to, over time, make choices that then shape our desires and to align our life to our values. And so that's our life to our values. It's not the other way around. It's not our values to our life. And so we're trying to use our Christian values as our moral compass, as our North Star, and we're trying to build our life around that. And that's ultimately so that we can one day better answer Jesus when he asks us, did you feed me when I was hungry? And did you clothe me when I was cold? Take care of me when I was tired or lonely? And for me, as a 1 on the Enneagram, I am, if you're familiar with that, I'm a die-hard perfectionist. And so I wish very hard to be perfect. And I wish I could be, but I'm not. Some examples of that are I take pride in being eco-friendly and in using as little plastic as I can, but I still buy takeout every so often. Every so often, my millennial itch starts to flare up and I want to travel. And causes a lot of carbon emissions, actually. So, if you don't think about these things, then you just don't. But when you do, you realize that your dollars are actually your votes. And so they're your votes for something, such as this initiative for the city, for this building, for this project, this dream. Or it could also be votes against something. So if I don't believe in something, I'm not going to put my money in it. I'm not going to spend on it. I'm not going to buy its products. And I'm certainly not going to donate to them. And so the ultimate goal here is to try and align our values to what Jesus asked us for, and to show that we're not about perfection. We're just about principles. And we're trying to not become perfect because that's unattainable, but we're trying to line up our principles so that one day they make sense. And it looks a lot like the principles that Jesus talks about. To close, I'll just share that right now it's 2019. That's 3 years after 2016 when DAPL was talked about. And actually in 2017, very shortly after, the project started and it finished. And so the pipeline exists and oil's flowing, and all the protests you could say are for naught. I had friends ask me, so is it worth it, what you did, divesting and causing inconvenience and change to your life? And I would say it is. It was worth it, because if I had known what was going to happen before it actually happened, or I could say if I wasn't even going to be there, say if you're not going to be in the city when the building closes, then should that matter? And the question is, does it matter? If you know what's going to happen and it's different from what you want, would you change your behavior? Why should you? Why should you change and sacrifice your generosity and your values for something that just doesn't turn out the way you know it will be? And most of the times we don't know how it'll turn out. So why not take a chance on being generous? So thank you.
Thanks, Clement. One of the things that I love about Clement and just Angela and their journey is how thoughtful they are about faith and about their faith and how it's really fleshed out in life. And especially when it comes to this topic of money, something so tangible that all of us experience and feel and touch. Now, here's the thing. Like last week, we talked about there's three main buckets when we talk about this approach to money. If you remember the three, I talked about there's give. Can I hear say give? Then there's save. Then there's spend. That's right. And most of us, when it comes to the culture that we live in, it's usually spend, and then we save, and then maybe we can give a little bit on the side, or whatever we have left, or whatever we have when the occasion calls for it, or we're moved somehow by some cause or sermon or whatever else it is. And one of the things that we talked about, how a faith orientation. Now, again, if you're not a Christian here, it's a great Sunday to be here, because this Sunday's not for you. But it's a great sneak peek into what do Christians believe about how we approach this thing called wealth and money. And this is something, again, whether you're religious or you're not, everyone deals with this topic of money. And we've been talking about how, again, culture tells us spend, then save. Now, some of us, maybe you're from a background like mine, where I came from an immigrant context where it was save before anything else. Then you spend, and then maybe you give. But this idea of saving, because there was this thing in me that said, I'll never have enough, we'll never have enough, our families will not have enough, our generations will not have enough, and therefore I need to save more than anything else. Now, if you think about it, this idea of saving before giving, or spending before giving, both spending and saving, one of them might be more virtuous than another. I might say oh yeah, at least I'm not totally flippant and using and casual about my money. At least I'm saving. But do you see, when saving becomes my idol, the same tentacles are in me. The tentacles of money, of security, of control. And my wife has known this, because in our marriage, saving is so important to me. We're constantly in these arguments but it shows, even though I might be so virtuous about money, at least I'm not spending on frivolous things. Instead, I'm saving money. Saving itself has become such an idol for me that, of course, for me, money still has its tentacles in me. And here's the thing, by virtue of you being in this place right now, in this city, money has its tentacles in you too. It consistently taunts you and me, but with, you don't have enough money. You don't have what it takes to live here. Oh, you better accumulate as much wealth as you can here before you get married, before you have kids, before whatever life passes you by. And as a result, what ends up happening is money continues to taunt you and me. That's the virtue of living in this city, because it's so dang expensive. Can I get an amen? Right? I mean, anyone, whether you have a lot of money or whether you have a little, Each of us have wrestled with this idea of money before and what we're supposed to do with it. To show you just how much saving is in me, I mean, when my wife and I first got married, I remember like when the winter months would come, like she would awake from her slumber, and I usually get up earlier than her, and I'd already be in the living room, and she'd come out of the bedroom, and she would see me, and I'd be dressed in like a parka and like sweatpants and socks, and she's like, did you go outside? Like, why are you all dressed up? And I'm like, no. What do you mean I went outside? And she goes, why is it freezing in here? I'm like, what do you mean it's freezing? Like, this, you should put on a parka as well. And she's like, we have this thing called a heater. Have you heard of this thing? It's called a heater. You turn it on when it gets cold. And I'm like, why would I spend money on that when I've already spent money on this parka? You know, that was my approach. But because again, what was in me, the tentacles of money that tell me, save, save, save. You're never going to have enough. And the one thing that we talked about last week, the one thing where we can stare money back in its face and throw it right back in its face is basically say, you've got nothing on me, money, is generosity, is we give our money away. And what marks the Christian journey then is that we are a people that before anything else, we give our money away. We give generously to those in need. We give generously to causes that we love and believe in, like Clement was talking about. Now, today we're actually going to talk about this topic of faith. Now, faith is so central to anyone who claims to be a Christian, and we're going to talk about how faith and a life of faith, what does it actually look like? Because it's talked about in so many different ways and in so many different times, especially in the teachings of Jesus and in the followers of Jesus, this topic of faith is brought up. So earlier what was read for us from Kathy was this passage from Hebrews chapter 11. Now, it's this whole chapter on faith, and now look at what the author of Hebrews, what he writes to these early Christians about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. He says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. In other words, it's confidence in what we hope for. I just basically reiterating this. This is what the ancients were commended for. They were commended for this idea that they lived by faith. They had confidence in what they hoped for. Now look at what it says. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Now here's what he's saying. He's basically saying, we know that it's by faith we believe this to be true, that God created the universe and everything in it. Now, some people might say, well, I don't have any faith. I believe in science. Well, even if you believe in science, when it comes to the origins of the world, when it comes to what you do with your life and the things that you believe in and the way that you align your values, you probably live by faith too. Maybe it's faith in something. Maybe it's faith in your career. Maybe it's faith in your intellect. Maybe it's faith in the degrees that you've inherited. Maybe it's faith in kind of your own prowess of living and navigating through the city. Every single one of us has faith in something. And what the writer of Hebrews is saying is faith for Christians is a faith in the invisible God, who we experience as the visible, true God. Now, look at what he says. He says, without faith, without this belief in who God is, it is impossible. Can I hear you say impossible? So it's not possible to please God. In other words, a life of living, a life of faith, that's the only way to please God, when we live believing in the assurance of hope that he has promised. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. In other words, the way that we live our lives then, the only way to please God is if we truly believe that he is who he says he is, the God of the universe, the God who sent Jesus to live and die on our behalf, to resurrect him, and for us to believe that. Now check out what he says, and he makes this distinction about faith and belief. Check this out. He says, go to the next slide. He says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Actually, this is the writer of James. So the writer of Hebrews talks about this idea of faith, how it's impossible to please God without. And the writer of James, when he talks about faith, James is basically the brother of Jesus. When he talks about this idea of faith, look at what he says. Brother, what good is it, my brothers and sisters? Someone claims to have faith but has no deeds. Can such faith save them? So in other words, here's someone who basically, what he's decrying is someone who basically says, I have faith in God. I trust him. I put my life in his hands, but what good is it if there's no deeds? What good is it if we're not actually acting out what we say, what we believe? So in other words, it's like saying, as a married person, if I say, oh yeah, like in my life, I believe in God, and my wife is wrong all the time in every conflict that we're in. Now, I might feel this right to say that, but I would be wrong. I'd be terribly wrong. And when I say if I truly believe in God, then it means that in Ephesians 5, it talks about mutually submitting to one another. It talks about sacrificing. And it also talks about humility, right? Like there's all sorts of ways that I might say, I believe in God. And you might be in this room and you might have come to this place and you might have said, I believe in God. The question is, do your actions show it? Do your deeds show it? And this is what James is getting at. And look at what he says. Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed. In other words, with my lips, I claim these virtues of faith, but yet does nothing. Nothing about their physical needs. What good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So in other words, James is giving this other texture to this idea of faith. That faith isn't just this belief. Like, yeah, I believe in God. I even attend church sometimes. I even raise my hands. I even listen to the preacher for about 5 minutes and then I doze off. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a faith that actually implements itself in deeds, in actions. And look at the distinction that James makes between faith and deeds. He says, someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. Now, when he talks about the distinction between belief and faith, look at what he says. You believe there's one God. You believe that. You say, I am a Christian, I believe that. Look what he says. Good. Even the demons believe, and they shudder. So he's basically saying, what good is it simply to say, I believe in this, who this God is? And if I don't have deeds, if I don't actually follow up with it, with action, if it's just mere intellectual assent, then what better am I than demons who also believe the same things? In fact, what better is it for anyone else who doesn't claim faith? Because we can talk all day about how much faith we have and about how God is everything to us. But when it comes down to it, what about our deeds? What about our actual lives and the way that we act? So for instance, if I were to bring a chair up to the stage and I were to ask this question, do you believe that this chair will hold you up? You know, many of us say, yes, we believe that the chair will hold us up. But what's the difference between merely intellectually assenting and actually demonstrating faith with deeds? It's this idea of actually coming and sitting in the chair and resting in the chair. And the question for you and for me that we're supposed to wrestle with, and the question that James is posing to the early church is this. When it comes to your faith that you talk about, when it comes to my faith that we talk about, when it comes to a faith that says, Jesus who says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, is that something that we say, yes, Jesus, but instead we harbor this grudge against all those people who have hurt us or wronged us, right? When Jesus teaches us about being kind and present with people, and yet at work, what we care about, not so much as being kind and present with people, we just care about the bottom line and making an extra buck or whatever else it might be. Have we missed the mark of the way of Jesus? You see, this comes time and time again when it comes to the teachings of Jesus, the aspirations, and the actual following through of it. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to the things that we spend in life, for instance, there's these 3 different things, and I know there's all different ways that we can talk about what we spend in life, but here's one way. Time, energy, and money. How we spend our time. What we do with our energy and with our gifts and our talents. And then there's this thing called money. Now, in many ways, our money is actually a representation of both time and energy. Have you heard this phrase, time is money? Anyone heard that phrase before? Especially in New York, you've probably heard that. Have you ever heard this phrase, energy is money? Neither have I. But in many ways, like money is representative of all of these things. Because the time that we spend, we're trying to accumulate money, especially in this town. And money becomes representative then of so much of our own lives and our own journeys. Now, here's the thing. Money is that one tangible thing for you and for me and for wherever you are in this faith journey where it becomes indicative of how much faith do you really have? How much faith is shown by where you put your money. You see, we have this phrase. This phrase is put your money where your mouth is. I mean, isn't that true? Because, and that phrase is not like some Christian phrase. That's just a phrase that talks about a wisdom principle. That your money and what you do with your money, something as tangible and tactile as your money, it actually demonstrates the larger story of your faith, of my faith. And the problem with that is that there's a part of me that constantly wants to say, no, money, that's a completely different topic, Drew. Like, sure, talk about, I like it when you talk about your relationship with your wife and how you mess up all the time and how you can't admit you're wrong. I like that part and acting that out. But hey, the money thing, like, that seems like a completely different topic. Like, don't you understand? Like, money is so central to it. This is why Jesus, of the top two topics that he would address, was poverty and money. One of the reasons why is because he knew that throughout human history, money has its tentacles in you. It has its tentacles in me. Whether you're, someone who likes to spend, whether you're someone who likes to save, either way, money has its tentacles in you and in me. And when it comes down to this idea of a life of faith that actually demonstrates itself in deeds, I want to ask you this question. Where is your money? What does that indicate about your faith? The larger story of your faith. Because again, money is that one thing that is indicative of where our faith is and where our actions really lie. Now, Jesus would actually say it this way. Check out Matthew chapter 6. When he talks about money, look at what he says. He says, for where your treasure is, in other words, where your money is, that's where your heart is also, or your heart will be also. Now notice, Jesus doesn't say where your heart is, that's where your money will go. And in fact, many of us, we say, well, you know what, honestly, like, I would give and I would be generous if, like, God just changed my heart. Well, here's what Jesus is basically saying. Well, it doesn't work that way. The way it works is basically where your money is. Let's just see where your money is. That's where your heart is. In other words, it's descriptive of where your heart already is. And the question for you and for me, if you are someone who says, I believe and I follow Jesus, my life is a life of faith. Jesus is like, well, where's your treasure? Where's your treasure? Where is your money? Now, in my experience, money is one of those super sensitive things that for each of us, we're like, wait, hey, Drew, you're getting way too personal here. But isn't it true? I mean, this is why Jesus talks about it so often. It's because money does, it touches to the core of our sense of identity, of control, of approval, of success, of safety. And what Jesus is trying to get at is he's trying to free us from those tentacles. Tentacles that are in you, tentacles that are in me. Now, here's the thing. Some of you are in this room, you're like, well, I'm just getting started in my career. I'm not nearly as greedy as my boss is. I'm not nearly as greedy as those people in this other industry, finance people, right? Like, or whatever, there's all these different ways in which people are, we talk ourselves out of this idea. No, money doesn't have its tentacles in me. Of course not. And I've shared even my own personal journey, because you're like, man, this preacher guy, he's talking about money so much, it's making me uncomfortable. And I mentioned last week, this is not because I need money from you. My wife is independently wealthy. I mentioned that last week, so I don't need your money. I really don't. I'm saying this because I want this for you. Because here's what I know about you and what I know about me. Even when I had very little money and when we've had a lot of money, here's what I've known. You know that fear, that wearing the parkas and putting the sweats on and this fear of like tight-fistedness? It's always been there. It continues to always be there. My wife and I are in a season now where we have a lot more wealth, and I've got tons of worries about whether or not our children will be taken care of in the next generation. Now, you know what's crazy about that is, like, I thought, oh, surely when we have more money, surely when I have more money, like, surely I'm going to be even more open-handed. But the opposite is true. And you and I know this, though. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It has its tentacles in us, because this is the city that we live in, where so much of our existence shrouds around money. Now, for people who say, well, my faith is what controls everything about my life. Question is, where is your money? Because if we can look at where your money is, we'll truly have an understanding of where is your faith? Is your faith, is it in your own control? Is your faith Again, I know this is dicey because all of these things, I'm not saying they're bad things. Is it in your family? Is your faith in your own intellect and smarts and ability to basically manufacture wealth or generate wealth for generations or whatever else it might be? Now, here's the thing. You and I, by virtue of living in this city, you're probably pretty talented. Either you're talented or you're incredibly driven. Not either or maybe hopefully you're both, right? Like, and the reality is in this city, so many of you are so smart, driven, talented. You've got all sorts of, your potential earning is like incredible through the roof. And here's the thing, when it comes down to faith, like, let's be honest. Is your faith at a point where you've entrusted everything to God, your intellect, your life, your future? Have you given everything to God, really? Or is there still a part of you that's like, actually, God, I'm actually pretty smart and good with money, and I've actually made it on my own. I worked hard for this, got scholarships, did whatever I could, and I'm smart enough, and like, hey, I'm living in this city, and because of that, I can do this on my own. I mean, I'll tell you what, for most of us, the story is we still, at the end of the day, we still trust ourselves. If we were to put our money where our mouth is, I'm going to put my money on my own kind of financial acumen. And here's what Jesus is basically saying. Like, see, money will indicate whether you've truly been all in with Jesus or not. Whether you've completely given your own control over to the master of the universe. And the question for you and the question for me is, where is your faith? Where is my faith? This is something that I struggle with constantly because this immigrant mindset was just like, man, I don't know. Like, now that we have all this money, if we give it away, then what's going to happen to our kids? And da-da-da-da. I mean, those thoughts continue to flood my mind. But I know that I'm not unique. It's not like I'm this kind of crazy person. I know that for all of us, money continues to taunt us. Continues to taunt you, continues to taunt me. And even now, there's a part of you that's like, I'm not going to give my money away. I'm already using it for spending on this stuff, or I'm saving my money, or I'm paying off my debts, or I'm doing whatever I can. And as a result, we don't live generously because we've just kind of talked our own selves out of it. Because why? Because the one who rules your life, it's not God. It's you. It's me. It's us. You know, a few years ago, I was actually at a retreat with a Franciscan priest named Richard Rohr, and we were out in New Mexico, and he had taken as a Franciscan priest, he took a vow of poverty. And you know what was the craziest thing was there was a group of pastors who was sitting around, and we were talking about prayer, and that led to a conversation about the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, which is a unique Christian belief. And so he starts talking about it, and this man was just so full of wisdom, and he says, in fact, I just wrote a book. And this book is coming out. I think it was today. This book is coming out. And so he pulls out this book. He pulls it out. And he goes, yeah, here's the book. And it's on this divine dance. And this is what the book is about. And he's looking at it. And he goes, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting publisher. And I look at the book. And he goes, oh, I've never used that publisher before. And then he goes, well, anyways. And he starts talking about and then there was a part of me, like, there was this anxiety that started to swell when he started talking about, he didn't even know who the publisher of the book was. I was like, that feels so irresponsible. And so like kind of he finishes talking a little bit and I'm like, Father Rohr, like you don't even know who the publisher is? Like, what do you do? You just kind of signed away your rights to this? What, that seems so irresponsible. He goes, he's like, yeah, he goes, usually I just publish with whoever asks me. And I was like, what? My goodness, like, I'm from New York. Like, we don't do that. And so as I was investigating this, I'm like, so what, like, why did you do this? And he goes, because I've taken a vow of poverty, like, it's interesting. I don't worry about how much money I can make or being taken advantage of, or it's because I just live my life and live a life of prayer out of freedom, knowing that God's going to take care of me. I was like, but still, like, I mean, there was this, and he goes, oh, the center of action and contemplation, like they're the ones who negotiate all that stuff. So I just, and I was like, but I came away from that so overcome by the freedom of this man to just be like, yeah, I just want to obey God, and I realized it took a vow of poverty for him to have like the tentacles and the taunts of money, to be freed from that. That's what it took. Now, I'm not here saying, hey, everyone here, take a vow of poverty. What I'm saying is, better yet, you can take a vow of generosity. You can throw money back in its face and basically say, you've got no hold on me. I live freely. Now, whether you're religious or you're not, isn't that the kind of life that every single one of us would want? Think about the anxieties that we live with, especially around money and finances. Will I have enough? Will I have enough for my family? All of these questions are indicative of the pressures that you and I feel, especially in this town. And what Jesus is basically saying is, where your treasure is, see, that's where your heart is. You can talk all day about, Jesus, you are my life. You are everything to me. But where your money is, that is where your heart is. Now, here's the thing, right? Like, I know that some of us, we're sitting in this room, we're like, oh, Drew, you're coming kind of hard at us, like this idea of money and this idea of faith. And faith, of course, is sitting in the chair. It's more than simply saying, yes, I believe this, but sitting in the chair, resting in the chair. And some of you are like, well, what if I don't believe that God will take care of me? Because you know what? I've been through life, and honestly, people have failed me. Institutions have failed me. I've been alone for most of my life. I can't trust anyone. The only one I can trust is myself. Have you ever been there before? And maybe you've taken steps of faith with God, and you say, God, I actually took a risk, and I did try to follow you. And honestly, it feels incredibly disorienting, and it feels like I'm losing control and my center. Have you ever been in that season before? And maybe some of you, because here's what we realize about faith. Faith is only as good as the object of one's faith, is what we put our faith in. I can say all day, I believe in the Knicks front office. But that's not going to change anything, y'all. I'm just kidding. Sorry. No one's a Knicks fan here, so sorry. I don't know. Or some of you are Knicks fans, and that wasn't funny. Right? But faith is only as good as what we have faith in. So if we have faith, and the object of our faith is something that's sturdy and that's strong, and maybe for some of us, maybe the reason why we're not willing to go all in with God, the reality is because we've wondered whether God truly is reliable, truly is who he says he is. And again, the author of Hebrews basically says, like, you see, the only way to please God is when we can approach God. It's impossible to please him. It's when we approach God and truly believe that he rewards those who act, who believe that the rewards of faith are worth it. And the book of Hebrews, the Hebrews chapter 11, is this book of people, time and time again, bloodshed, torment, death even, where they believe in God so fervently, they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. They're willing to put their lives on the very line. And the question for you and for me, is God worth it? Have you ever wondered that before? And maybe that's what's been holding you and me back. We would rather trust in ourselves. We would rather trust in our degrees. We'd rather trust in our own financial acumen. You know what's interesting is that the early church, and remember in our series Radical, we talked about how the early church, somehow there was this unstoppable move of Christian witness in the midst of persecution and bloodshed and difficulty, that somehow Christianity continued to grow. And where did it come from? It came from this supernatural engine of belief empowered by the Holy Spirit to believe that God is worth it. He's worth it. And if we can just entrust our lives to him, he can do a phenomenal work. And the question for you and for me is, have I ever put myself into a place where we've said, God, I have enough faith in you that I'm going to put myself, my money, in a position where I'm going to do something so faith-filled. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to trust that you're going to do something miraculous. Have you and I ever put ourselves in that kind of situation? Well, the early church did. Why would the early church do that? Well, Paul gives us this clue when he writes to the church in Ephesus. Look at what he writes about who this God is. when he's encouraging the early church in the midst of difficulty, trial, suffering, bloodshed. Look at what Paul says about who God is. He says this. Go to the next slide, Ephesians chapter 3. He says, "For this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth," basically saying, I kneel before the God who's over heaven and earth and everything in it. I mean, isn't this unbelievable? He's basically talking about access to a God who's over the heavenlies. Have you ever been around like a celebrity before, or someone who has a lot of money? I know that whenever I am about to meet someone famous or popular or has a lot of wealth, I start getting a little nervous, like a little bit kind of just as hard as it is for me to talk right now. That's basically how I get. Right? I get nervous, anxiety. I mean, can you imagine though? Like, here's what Paul's basically saying: like the God who's over heaven and earth. This is the God who we pray to. And look what he says. In heaven and earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches, he's richer than the richest person in the world. Out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all of the fullness of God. I mean, do you see what he's doing? What Paul is doing is he's reminding the people of God, when you put your money where your mouth is, when your life is fully entrusted to the God whose name is above every name, whose love is fierce and for you. When you do that, look at what happens. He says, to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine. He says, immeasurably more, not just more, immeasurably more. You don't even know the kind of goodness that God has for you. Can't even be measured. According to his power that is at work within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. I mean, isn't this beautiful? See, what Paul is basically saying is, like, it's not some sort of blind faith. It's a faith in the object who's worthy of our highest everything. It's the God over heaven and earth. It's the God who says, when you give, when you are generous, I will reward you. Not in some prosperity kind of way, but I will show you that I am enough. And look at what he says. I will do to the God who will do not just more, immeasurably more than all you and I can either ask or imagine. And the question for me and the question for you, have you ever put your money in a place where you said, God, I want you to do immeasurably more. Immeasurably more. And the reality is most of us, we're like, how about I give you a little bit of this, And then maybe, God, you can do something with that. And maybe the reason why God hasn't done immeasurably more is because you have not exercised enough faith. You know what's interesting is that Jesus, when he would do miracles, there'd be moments when he couldn't do miracles in his hometown because they lacked faith. In other words, there's this interesting interplay of faith and the work of God. And the question is, have you entrusted your life to the God who can do immeasurably more? Have you entrusted your money, which is representative of so much of our lives, especially in this town, have you entrusted it to the God of heaven and earth, who says, man, if you can just let go, if you can just let go, I can do immeasurably more than all you can ask or